Hey everyone, welcome. This is the fourth episode of the Dandelion Seed podcast. I'm your host, Rachel, and today I want to jump in and share a little bit more of our story in which we discovered that God always has a plan, and sometimes, not always, but sometimes He will even let us see it. So, we left off in episode 3 talking about my most horrible, terrible, very bad year ever. And I'm talking about 2016. And no, it has nothing to do with the election and everything to do with how our life took a complete tailspin. We went from happily employed, living in beautiful, romantic Japan, to being jobless, homeless, and washed up on American shores. And then we wrecked our only house, which is a camper van, all within the first 5 months. So yeah, it was quite a year. And then I described how when we finally limped ourselves to a place of refuge, that safe place turned out to be anything but. And I shared how Satan really tried to do us in our finances, our marriage, our family relationships, and honestly, even our will to live. So yes, things got so bad that both my husband and myself, separately, seriously contemplated ending it all. And I'm not kidding. But for the grace of God, and of course, the absolute love of our two precious sons, we did not heed the call of despair, but instead clung to the promises of God, even though we saw at that time no hope for our future, like none. That story is in episode 2 and 3, so please go have a listen. All of this will make a lot more sense. But let's get on with the next installment. First, let me say this podcast was never intended to be episodic, meaning you don't have to listen to one show in order to understand or follow the next. But for the sake of human interest, we really do have a pretty crazy story because we serve a crazy, amazing God. And so there's a lot more coming your way. So anyways, I left off episode 3 by describing the terrible living conditions that we had when we were in Virginia. Oh, outwardly, they were wonderful. We were offered a charming old home to stay in while my husband was desperately seeking for work. We found an incredible church family. We made some really new and interesting friends. A lot of them were of international renown, so that was sort of fun. I continued homeschooling the boys. I volunteered at Awana. Overall, our days were pretty peaceful and happy, but the jobs for my husband were just not forthcoming, and our debt was piling up. And to make matters worse, time was ticking away, and our season of living in that old house had, well, let's just say it had expired, although at the time it was unbeknownst to us. And I will never forget, it was Thanksgiving of 2016. And we were visiting some very old friends that we had for the holiday. It was nearly time for dinner, and then my husband gets this phone call from an unknown number, like on Thanksgiving Day. So he retreats to a corner of the living room, and I can see out of the corner of my eye, he's listening really intently. He's looking really highly engaged. It definitely seemed like an odd time for a phone call, but, I'm thinking, oh, must be somebody calling to wish happy Thanksgiving. I don't know. Now, these friends we were visiting, we had not seen them in several years. In fact, since we saw them last, we had moved to Japan and they had moved to Italy, and then we'd all moved back, only we moved back unexpectedly, and we got retired out of the military, had landed in America with no job, no money, only the camper van to call home until we crashed our camper. And I told you that story, how we were stuck for 2 months. So we're relaying this entire story to our friends and then bringing them up to speed with how we were living in this old house in Virginia. But apparently, the time frame that was allotted for us to live there was approximately 3 to 4 weeks, because about 1 month into our stay, we started receiving very strong indications that they wanted us gone, and we had overstayed our welcome. Had we known it would be of such short duration, we certainly would have made different plans, but we were desperate. We thought it would be great. But that's everything in a nutshell. So, we left out the details like busting my knee at the Grand Canyon, learning how to build a tequila brand, going to a Super Bowl party at Trump Tower in Las Vegas, but I digress. So here we were at our friend's Thanksgiving table, bringing them up to speed on all of our crazy adventures, most of which anchored on this totally unplanned pit stop in Las Vegas. So you can listen to episode 3 for more details of how we spent a summer there. And of course, a lot of our discussion revolved around Vegas itself, the heat, the casinos, people's shoes melting to the asphalt, all the different things that we saw and smelled and experienced in our time there. And I'm pretty sure most of the commentary ended in, and if I never have to go back to Vegas again, it'll be too soon. And that is precisely when we all kind of turned and noticed my husband sitting at the end of the Thanksgiving table, just grinning like the Cheshire Cat. And I vaguely recall, like, in that moment, pausing with my fork halfway to my mouth, like knowing something big was about to drop. And he says, "So," insert long pause here, "about Las Vegas." And in that moment, somehow I knew deep, deep down in the core of my being, before he even said another word, I knew we were moving to Las Vegas. And then at my friend's dinner table, out it all spilled. That job interview, that phone call had been a job interview of all things on Thanksgiving Day. So apparently, while my friends and I were busy gabbing and setting out food, my husband was busy sending resumes out on his iPhone. And lo and behold, another guy who can't stop working ever received my husband's resume on Thanksgiving and wanted to speak with him right away. So at this point, we had been unemployed for 7 months and job opportunities were looking pretty bleak. So, of course, none of us had any issues with him taking a work call on a holiday. It was the conclusion of that work call that had us all reeling. So he had submitted his resume to a very small elite company based in Las Vegas. It's a company where they fly fighter jets on contract for the United States Air Force. So this company had just won a huge flight contract, and they were looking to get jets into the air as soon as possible, which meant they needed to hire qualified pilots like yesterday. And as it happened, this interview that my husband was on, that phone call I told you about, it was more of a when can you start, how fast can you get here conversation, rather than the guy grilling my husband on, those typical interview questions like, what are your strengths and what are your weaknesses? I mean, heck, they are all fighter pilots. They know each other's strengths and weaknesses. Besides, this guy had already done the, I'm using air quotes, you can't see me here, but the bro check. And in other words, he had already called a couple other military buddies to inquire about my husband. And since they're all just like 2 to 3 degrees of separation in the aviation community, it turns out my husband quickly received raving reviews, which is no surprise, both because of his character and his flying skills. And so, I mean, just like that, he had a job offer and we were moving to Las Vegas. It happened that fast. So many times over the years, I have often pondered this idea that God might have conveniently put me in social situations whenever my husband needed to break undesirable news to me. On closer examination, I'm a little less certain it was the Lord's doing. I'm a little more convinced it was actually a calculated effort on my husband's part. Kind of like the guy who takes his fiancée to a public restaurant to break up with her so she won't cause a scene. That is exactly how it felt when my husband let it slip that we got orders to Texas. We were sitting in our friend's living room. Or the time he couldn't take off of work for that vacation we planned. He announced that at a church barbecue. Of course, I'm not going to flip my lid in front of the pastor. So it's funny how bad news always seemed to get delivered in a public environment. However, this time I knew that the bad news, or I'm air quoting bad news, was authentic because I'd seen the phone call. And this perfectly timed piece of news must have been the Lord's handiwork because instead of collapsing into a puddle of angry tears, everyone around that Thanksgiving table all had a good, hearty laugh. I mean, the irony of it all. Moving to Las Vegas after we just spent the summer stuck there and we were just relaying the stories of how much we hated it. And off the Howards went within 2 months' time to Las Vegas. So the Lord's hand was in that timing too, because as we were packing and preparing to leave Virginia, the situation at our home, that beautiful older home I was telling you about that was kind of gifted to us temporarily to live in, it was growing exponentially worse, like by the minute. So with that all happening, we packed up our camper, and I'm telling you, we hightailed it out of Virginia to Las Vegas. I honestly didn't know whether to cry about our destination or celebrate and rejoice about being rescued out of an increasingly toxic living situation. So honestly, in the end, I did exactly both, often in the same breath. I'm sure I was a complete joy on that car ride, but I wouldn't know because apparently I have blocked the whole thing out. I have no memory of that, however many days it took us to get out there. It's like a black hole in my memory. So what I do remember was when we rolled into town. It is now February of 2017. And if you think the desert is any bit warmer than the snowy East Coast, you are very mistaken. I know all these snowbirds, they all travel down from Canada every year trying to keep warm, but honestly, I do not understand why they don't just keep on going to better places, unless I suppose all the better places are already filled up. So look, I'm not trying to knock on anybody who loves the desert. There are parts of the desert, I will admit to you, are absolutely breathtakingly beautiful. God just didn't make me a desert person. I grew up on the East Coast. I like green. I like trees. I like a growing season. So it was a very difficult adjustment for me to go to Nevada, not just because of the geography, but largely also because of the culture. Except for a short stint in Virginia, we pretty much went from military life, in Japan no less, to the three-ring circus, otherwise known as Las Vegas. And you can hardly find a more traditional, lovely, polite culture than in Japan. And then there's the opposite end of the spectrum, basically what you find in Las Vegas. So it was a culture shock on many, many levels. So here we are, our family in Sin City, with our young, impressionable children, and we're a Christian family, you know, we homeschool. So if you go down the list of all the different things of this scenario that did not fit our family, Las Vegas pretty much met every single one of them. But that's where the job was. And like I said, we were homeless. We had no car. We had no money. We had nowhere to live. We had no future. We had no idea. We were absolutely destitute. So we took the job. And because we had an RV, that's what we lived in. And oh, but my friends, it gets even better. So here's the day I remember. I remember rolling in our RV into the Nellis Air Force Base RV park. So this is in Las Vegas, and it is just before dark. And remember, it's February. It had been a really long trip, but thank God it was significantly less eventful than our last trip through town where we blew tires and were washed on the side of the road. So for that, I'm grateful. And like I said, I really don't remember it. So, you know, that's a good thing. No news is good news. We checked in at the campground office. And if I recall correctly, the people who run the RV park had managed to give us a reservation for the very, very last spot, and the entire RV park was totally full. And we're talking over 300 RVs. So it is a humongous campground. And apparently the space that they saved for us was what they would call a leftover space. They pretty much just kind of crammed us into a corner. It was a space created just for us. So when I tell you that we were dry camping on a patch of dirt, I am not kidding. The ground was dusty, red sand and rock. We had no indoor plumbing. We had no indoor sewage. And what I mean by that is we had to go use the bathrooms on the campground if we needed a shower or if we needed a toilet or any of that stuff, if we had to brush our teeth. We had to wash our dishes at the spigot outside of our camper, where the winter wind was just whipping and clawing at your clothing and the water was just freezing cold coming out of that tap. So I would put a bucket underneath a spigot and just scrub as fast as I could because your hands would go totally numb. Either that, or we would occasionally sneak past the do not enter sign at the campground kitchen because they had this outdoor kitchen, so it had a roof over it. But their sink had glorious hot water. So we would sometimes sneak in after dark with like just a small flashlight so that nobody would chase us away, because technically we weren't supposed to use the campground kitchen. That was only for special events. But man, we were like super desperate. So, I mean, guys, this might be TMI, right? But at some point, I remember feeling so stinking desperate to just be able to get up in the middle of the night and not have to put on layers of clothing, my pants and socks and shoes and coat and hat in the middle of the night when it was absolutely freezing outside, to go hike over to the bathroom and pee. At some point, I literally broke down and I bought a child's sand bucket. You know those little plastic sand buckets that you would build a sandcastle with at the beach? Yeah, those. And I got a bucket, and in the middle of the night, I would pee in the bucket. It was like a chamber pot, you guys, in the middle of the night. And I also had to make very sure that I always put the bucket in the shower, just in case anybody else came into the bathroom in the dark in the middle of the night and knocked it over and my pee would run all over the floor. So that is literally what our life had come to. I'm telling you, it had just been months and months of trauma piled upon trauma, upon trauma, upon trauma. There are things I haven't even shared with you here, but long story short, it all kind of culminated with me peeing in a bucket. And I was like, really, Lord? Really? I mean, that is where everything pretty much bottomed out, is when we went back to Las Vegas. Now, I'll have to expand on that in the future, because it was not a good season. And there's a lot to unpack there. I did not weather it well. In that time of desperation, I did a lot of walking. I did a lot of praying, if you can call it praying. It was really more like wrestling with God. It was really probably more accusing him more than anything. And as just as an aside, isn't that an interesting twist? Here I sit, all offended that I was falsely accused in Virginia. And so for that story, go to episode 3. But yet I'm leveling false accusations at God when he took us to Las Vegas. So I'm sure glad that he's long-suffering and patient and forgiving, because I have yet to fully forgive all the terrible things that have been leveled at me in my past. Anyways, you know how they say that the Lord will not give you more than you can handle? I mean, maybe that is true. I'm sure it probably is, but he certainly will take you right up to the very, very edge. And we lived in those conditions with no plumbing, no running water, peeing in a bucket for 3 long winter months before the campground finally came and knocked on our door and said, hey, we've got a spot for you. You can move your camper and go hook up your sewer and water. So anyways, why am I telling you this story? Well, for one, I wanted to paint the picture that it was not fun in any way. And secondly, I want you to understand it was a very long season. I mean, that time without plumbing, that was really rough. And that was after all the other things that had happened to us that you can hear in the previous episodes. And then after that time, we eventually got plumbing, and that got a little bit better because, obviously I no longer had to pee in a bucket. I could wash my dishes inside. But mostly I'm sharing this story to illustrate how God was unfolding a much bigger plan in our lives than I could possibly see at that time. All I could see was that we had gone from a beautiful, wonderful home in a vibrant community in amazing Japan to living in a freezing cold trailer in the miserable desert with no plumbing. But looking back, I realized the Lord had prepared my heart to endure it. And he does that a lot of times for us. First thing he did, he had provided an escape from a very toxic situation back in Virginia, and we needed out of that situation. Second, God had allowed us, or forced us rather, to spend time familiarizing ourselves with this city that I feared so much. I mean, because we spent those months there when we were stuck, when our camper broke down, he opened my eyes to the fact that normal people really do live there. I mean, not everyone in Las Vegas is a prostitute or a mafia man. Sure, there's plenty of those, but there's normal people too. There's dentists and grocery clerks and all sorts of people who live perfectly ordinary lives. There were churches and homeschoolers and countless believers who did not partake in Sin City's various offerings. So, side note, I also learned that not everyone who produces a liquor label is a menace to society. So, more on that later, but it does play a role, believe me. So, while I was licking my wounds about being stuck in the desert that previous summer, the summer our RV broke down, I could never have imagined that the Lord was using that time to gently introduce the idea of Las Vegas as our future home. And so while I was shaking my fist in anger, in reality, God was being kind. He gave us family in Vegas to take us in when we were broken. He provided safety and security under their roof when we were destitute. He gave us love and fellowship and mentorship. Remember that liquor label comment? He even gave my children a swimming pool, a private swimming pool, but mostly he was preparing me to accept the plans that he knew laid before me. And he knew that those plans would be oh so hard for me to swallow. So you see, God knows each one of us deeply and intimately, and he knew how broken my heart was about leaving Japan and losing our military community. Oh, I mean, I knew we would eventually find another job someday. Jobs are replaceable. Jobs are interchangeable, but communities are not. And locations are not. God made me to love forests and gardens and streams and places that are peaceful and out of doors. I was raised climbing trees and riding horses and running free on acres of land. And the Lord knew my absolute distaste for and distrust of cities. And he knew especially that I despised Sin City. In fact, Las Vegas was the one place on earth I had literally vowed I would never, ever go. I don't know why, but that was something that I had thought my whole life, I'm never going to go there. Like I wanted to someday lay on my deathbed and proudly say, I never went to Las Vegas. Isn't that weird? That was literally a vow that I had made in my heart. There's probably much more valuable things I could have sworn to myself, but that was one. So the Lord knew he was asking me to do what to me was an impossible thing, to go to a place I hate, a place that is opposite to everything in my being, everything he made me to be, and to go at a time when I was the most weak and the most vulnerable. So he carefully and lovingly prepared me, even though I could not see it at the time. Don't get me wrong. I definitely did see the blessings. Every single day I was grateful for them. But I could not see the plan. I couldn't understand the purpose in it. Because simply put, it's usually quite often not ours to see. So I heard a quote the other day by a Danish philosopher, Kierkegaard, and it pretty much sums up our walk of faith quite perfectly. And he says, life can only be understood backwards, but it must be lived forwards. Well, it turns out that Kierkegaard was a Christian, and although this quote is not overtly faith-based, it frames a believer's trust in God quite nicely. In the moment of pain, I couldn't understand so many things that happened to us. I couldn't understand, why did my husband lose his job so unfairly? I couldn't understand why we couldn't find a place for ourselves in Virginia. That's where my family was. I wanted to be there. I certainly did not understand why in the world our camper broke down in Las Vegas, of all places, and we were stuck there all summer when we really needed to get to the East Coast so he could start looking for a job. It didn't make any sense. But when that phone call came in on that Thanksgiving day, offering my husband a job in Las Vegas, we all sat around the table and had a good laugh because everyone suddenly understood exactly why we had been stuck there in Vegas. God had been preparing us, my family, for the next step. And we absolutely could not see it at the time. So the point to all this is that God does have a plan, but He will put his children through some pretty rigorous training before he sends them into battle. He will test your heart before he gives you his reward. Think about Moses' time in the desert before he could lead his people out of Egypt. Remember that? Remember David hiding in the caves before God allowed him to become king? And like Israel wandering in the wilderness before they were allowed to enter the promised land. God didn't do anything different with me than he does with any one of his servants. He puts us all through a time of preparation before we are ready to serve his kingdom. Now, I'm still not sure why the good Lord had me peeing in a bucket. I suppose he was testing my hardiness or maybe my creative ingenuity. Maybe he was just sharpening my camping skills. I'm really not sure. Most likely he was testing my faithfulness, and I'd be lying if I told you I was not teetering on the edge. It sure did make me appreciate indoor plumbing almost as much as I appreciated the air conditioning that he gave us in July. But that's a story for another day. If you're going through a hard time right now, if you are struggling to understand why these trials, these frustration, these irritating things, these nonsensical things have happened to you, I get it. I understand. I did that too. I don't want you to think for 1 second that I sailed through that whole period and thought, oh, well, I guess God must be doing something. I'm just going to trust in him. I wish that had been my mentality. I'm telling you, it was not. And it's human nature to try and comprehend. We want to try to make sense of things that don't add up. It takes a great deal of faith to rest in the truth of what Kierkegaard wisely said. We can only go through this life moving forward. But someday we will understand it looking backwards. So thanks so much for joining me in this episode of the Dandelion Seed Podcast. I hope you were encouraged by this, and I look forward to meeting you here next time.